The contract was already signed before Clara Ashwood was called down to the parlor. She knew it the moment she stepped through the doorway and saw the folded papers on her father's desk, the pen still uncapped beside them, the ink not yet dry on the second signature. Her father looked up from where he sat with Ellis Marsh at the low table, both men holding coffee cups, both of them settled in the manner of men who had closed a matter without needing to consult the person it closed around. "There you are, Clara. Come in and shake Mr. Marsh's hand. Preston will ride out from the freight office at the end of the week." She had known the arrangement was coming since the calf sale in August, when her father had first spoken Preston Marsh's name at supper the way another man might have spoken of a promising bull. She had prepared herself for the announcement. She had not prepared for the signed papers, or for the mildness with which her father delivered the news, as though he had ordered a new harness rather than promised his only living daughter. She crossed the room and offered her hand to Ellis Marsh, who was a broad man in a broad coat and who took her hand the way a banker takes a promissory note. "Miss Ashwood, your father tells me you keep his books." "I do. Preston has a good head for figures himself. You'll have that in common." He smiled the practiced smile of a man who had already stopped listening for her answer and turned back to her father. "Sela's, the freight route runs through Fall. If we can put the boy up here through calving, he'll learn what he needs of the ground." Her father agreed. Clara stood between them another half-minute, forgotten in a room whose air had shifted around her without her consent, and when neither man spoke to her again, she stepped back through the parlor door and out onto the porch. She had not cried. She would not. The wind off the north pasture smelled of coming snow, and she stood a long moment with her hands flat on the porch rail, gathering herself the way she had learned to gather calves in a scatter slowly, without letting the cold get into her. A man was coming up from the calving shed with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a lantern hooked at his belt. He had not been on the ranch a week. Her father had hired him at the stock auction in Cheyenne to help through the hard months when the herd came in heavy, and the shed ran 3 deep with mothers. He touched the brim of his hat when he saw her at the rail, but did not slow, and something in the way he did not slow, did not turn his face up for a second look, did not ask what a woman was doing standing alone on the porch at dusk with nothing in her hands, steadied her. He walked as if he had no interest in a house he had not been invited into. She watched him go on toward the tack shed with the rope, and she thought without meaning to, that man will not know about the papers until someone tells him, and even then he will not care. She did not know his name. She had passed him twice that week in the yard and had not asked. Her father's hands came and went, and Clara had learned young not to grow accustomed to their faces. When she turned back to the door, her sister Josie was standing just inside the parlor with her hand still on the latch, having heard enough. Josie was 17 and had a face that could not hide things, and she looked at Clara now the way she had looked at their mother's coffin, steady and stricken at once. She said nothing. Clara touched her arm as she passed, went upstairs to her own room, closed the door behind her, and sat down at the small writing desk by the window without lighting the lamp. Below the window, the man from the shed was crossing the yard again, his lantern lit now against the last of the dusk. He walked evenly, without hurry, a man carrying his own weight and no one else's. Clara watched him until he passed out of the light and thought, without knowing why she thought it, that a person could stand a good while in a room next to a man like that and not feel crowded. The papers were already signed. There was nothing more her father needed from her but the wedding itself. His name was Wyatt Hale, and she learned it not from him but from the foreman, who mentioned it in passing while going over the winter feed order at the kitchen table 2 mornings after the parlor announcement. The foreman was an older man named Doss who had been on the Ashwood ranch since Clara was a child, and he laid the receipts out flat with the flat of his hand and asked her, without ceremony, whether she wanted the new man kept on past calving. "Hale," she said, testing the name. "Wyatt Hale. The one your daddy pulled off the auction hire line in Cheyenne. Quiet, works clean, doesn't drink his pay. I'd keep him if the note allowed." Clara ran her pencil down the feed column and made a small mark beside a figure she meant to correct later. Talk to my father. If he'll wear it against the spring wages, keep him. Das nodded once and folded the receipts back into his coat. He paused at the door with his hat in his hand, the way he sometimes did when he had something more to say and was deciding whether it was his place. Miss Clara, he's been asking after the calving book. Says the count on the November losses looks light to him. He'd like a word with whoever keeps it. She looked up. Send him to me. Das did not answer for a moment. Then he nodded again and went out, and Clara sat with the pencil still in her hand a long minute after the door had closed behind him. Nobody on the crew asked to see her books. Nobody on the crew knew that she kept them. Her father let it be understood, even to the men who had been on the place a decade, that the ledgers were his own hand. It was a kindness of a certain kind. It was also a fence. Wyatt Hale came up to the house that afternoon with his hat off and his boots scraped clean on the porch step, which she noticed because most of the hands did not bother. She met him at the kitchen door rather than the parlor. The kitchen was hers in a way the parlor was not, and she did not want to receive him where her father received bankers. Mr. Hale. Ma'am. He held the calving book against his chest, one broad hand flat over the cover. He was taller than she had judged from the porch rail, and closer to 30 than to 25, with the weathered look of a man who had worked outside a long time in country that did not give back. His eyes were a pale gray that took a moment to settle on a thing before they moved. Foreman said the count was yours. It is. He accepted that without lifting his eyebrows, which surprised her, and set the book open on the kitchen table between them. He turned it so the November column faced her. 6 losses posted. I count 9 head not accounted for in the shed record. 3 of them were carrying. If we lost them, we lost them, but the number ought to say so. Clara sat down at the table without being asked and drew the book toward her. She followed his finger down the column, then flipped back 3 pages to the shed record he had cross-checked against, then forward again to the losses. He was right. She had posted 6 because her father had told her 6 at the end of the month, and she had not gone out to the shed herself in November because she had been kept indoors with a cough that would not clear. You're right, she said. Yes, ma'am. She looked up at him then. He was not smug about it. He was not pleased with himself for having caught a woman in an error. He was standing on the other side of the table with his hat in one hand and his weight settled evenly on both boots, waiting for her to decide what she wanted to do with the information. I'll correct it, she said. That's all I came for. He touched the brim of his hat, took his book back off the table, and went out through the kitchen door the way he had come in. Clara sat a moment with her hand still flat on the corrected page, and she thought, with a small, clean shock she did not want to examine too closely, that no man in that house had ever brought her a wrong number and simply expected her to fix it. Preston Marsh rode in at the end of the week on a bay gelding too fine for the country and a saddle too new for the horse. Clara saw him from the upstairs window before her father did, saw the way he sat the gelding easy on the flat but shortened up nervous on the last slope down to the yard, the way a man rides when he has been taught in a ring and not on a hill. He was younger than she had expected, closer to her own age than to his father's, with a clean-shaved face and the kind of good clothes a freight office paid for. Her father met him at the porch step with both hands out, and Clara came down the stairs at the pace she would have used for any guest, no faster and no slower. Preston took her hand at the parlor door and held it a beat longer than the introduction warranted, and she felt, without any particular unkindness in the feeling, that he was measuring her the way his father had measured her, checking the goods against the paper. Miss Ashwood. I hope the ride out wasn't a trouble for you to expect me on such short notice. It wasn't. Father says you keep the books. I do. He smiled the way a man smiles at a talent he intends to retire. Well, there won't be much need of that once we're settled. The freight office keeps its own accountant and the house in town has staff enough that you won't have to trouble yourself over columns. Clara did not smile back. She did not correct him either. She said, "You'll want coffee after the ride," and went into the kitchen for the pot, and she was aware, even with her back turned, that her father had heard the exchange and had chosen not to interrupt it. Preston stayed through supper and slept in the guest room off the parlor. In the morning, he asked to be shown the ranch, and her father sent him out with Das because her father had a bad hip that winter and did not ride the whole property anymore. Clara did not offer to go, and neither man asked her to. She watched the two of them ride out from the porch, Preston on the bay and Das on the sorrel he had ridden for years, and she stood a while after they were gone with her hands in her coat pockets and the cold coming up off the hardpack. Wyatt was at the wood pile splitting rounds for the kitchen stove. He worked at a steady rhythm, the axe going down clean and coming up clean, and he did not look toward the porch as the two riders passed, though they passed close enough that the bay shied at the sound of the axe and Preston pulled it up sharp. Wyatt set another round on the block and split it, and Preston rode on, and Clara noticed that Wyatt did not glance after him. It was not indifference. It was the kind of not looking that a man does on purpose. She crossed the yard to the woodpile because it seemed to her that if she did not, she was going to sit in the kitchen with her hands folded until the day ended. "Mr. Hale." He rested the axe head on the block and turned to her. "Ma'am, I wanted to say I was grateful for the correction on the calving book. I've amended the account." "Yes, ma'am," Das said. She stood a moment with her hands still in her pockets. There was a question she wanted to ask him and no proper way to ask it, so she asked another one instead. "Where did you work before Cheyenne?" "2 winters up on the Powder River, a summer in the Big Horn Basin before that, some years south of here before my father died and I came back north to settle his affairs." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without inviting further asking. "Family still in the country?" "No, ma'am, just me." She nodded. She could think of nothing more to say that was not an intrusion, and she was not the sort of woman to make intrusions on a hand she barely knew. She turned to go back to the house, and Wyatt said, without lifting the axe, "Ma'am, your visitor's horse is throwing off a shoe on the near hind. He'll want to know before he takes it back to town." Clara paused. "Thank you, I'll tell him." She walked back to the house thinking that Wyatt Hale had noticed a loose shoe on a horse he had watched ride past for less than a minute, and that Preston Marsh, who had ridden the animal in from the freight office, had not. Preston rode out the next morning without hearing about the shoe. Clara told him at breakfast, and he waved it off with a piece of toast in his hand and said the smith in town would look at it when he got back, and that a hand who spent his time watching another man's horse ought to have more of his own work to do. Her father did not answer that, which Clara noticed. Her father had never been slow to defend a good hand, and his silence sat on the table between them for a moment before he changed the subject to the freight contract Preston's father was chasing through the winter. She walked Preston to the porch when he left. He kissed the side of her hand at the step, which she permitted, and told her he would be back the second week of January. He said it the way a man says he will be back to pick up a delivery. She stood on the porch until the bay was out of sight, and she thought about the shoe, and about her father's silence, and about the way Preston had said a hand who spent his time watching another man's horse, the small edge of contempt in the words, the ownership already in his voice when he said them. The bay threw the shoe entirely 2 miles down the road. Das brought word back that evening, having been sent by her father to fetch the horse. Preston had walked it into town, ruined the animal's near hind hoof in the last mile, and blamed the smith who had shot it a month prior. He had not asked after the man who had tried to warn him. Her father received this news at supper without comment, but he set his fork down before he was finished eating, which he did not often do, and he was quiet through the rest of the meal. The next morning he called Clara into the parlor. He did not ask her to sit. He stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the yard, and he spoke without turning. "The Marsh boy's father wants the wedding in April, before spring calving. That's earlier than we said." "It is. Ellis Marsh says the freight route is opening up through the passes then, and Preston will be needed at the office through the summer. He'd like the wedding done and the two of you settled in town before the passes clear." Clara stood in the middle of the parlor with her hands folded loose in front of her. "And what did you tell him?" Her father was a long time answering. He was looking down at the yard, at the wood pile where Wyatt Hale had gone back to splitting rounds in the pale morning light, though Clara could not see this from where she stood and did not know that this was what her father was looking at. I told him April was agreeable. She did not speak. She waited. Her father turned from the window. He looked older than he had at supper, older than he had at the parlor table when he had signed the papers, and there was something in his face that was not quite regret and not quite defiance. Clara, the note on the herd comes due in June. Ellis Marsh has said he'll carry it for a year at his own bank's rate if the wedding closes before spring. If it doesn't, the note goes to the county bank at whatever they'll charge me, and I'm not sure what they'll charge me. So you signed me to a freight route. He did not flinch. I signed you to a man who will keep this ranch out of the county bank's hands. That is what I could give you. Clara felt the cold come up through the floorboards into her boots. She said in a voice quieter than she had meant, "You could have told me. I am telling you. Before the papers." He looked at her a long moment. "I did not know how to tell you before the papers." She left the parlor without answering. She went upstairs and put on her heavier coat and came back down through the kitchen and out into the yard. And she walked past the wood pile without looking at Wyatt Hale. And she walked past the tack shed and past the calving pens and out to the far fence line where the wind came off the north pasture unbroken. And she stood there a long time with her hands in her pockets and did not cry, because she had promised herself in the parlor that she would not. And she was a woman who kept her promises to herself when she could keep no others. She was still at the fence when Wyatt found her. He did not walk out on purpose. He had gone to the north pasture to check a length of wire that had been sagging in the last 2 storms, and he came up the fence line with a pair of pliers in one hand and a coil of wire over his shoulder, and he stopped when he saw her. He did not turn around. He came the rest of the way at the same pace he had been walking, and he stopped an arm's length short of her at the post. "Ma'am, if I'm intruding, I'll go on." "You're not." He waited. He did not look at her face. He looked at the wire where it met the post, at the place where it had pulled loose from the staple, and he set the pliers down on the top rail and unhooked the coil from his shoulder and began to work without saying anything more. He did not fill the silence. He let her have it. She stood watching him thread new wire through the staple and pull it tight against the post, and after a while she said, "The wedding's been moved to April." He did not stop working. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "You don't have to be sorry, it's not your business." "No, ma'am." He set the staple and hammered it home with 3 even strokes, and he tested the wire with the back of his hand, and he moved on to the next post without speaking. She walked with him. She did not offer to help, and he did not ask. She walked a pace behind him along the line and watched him work, and she thought that if she went back to the house now, she would have to sit at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her, and she would not be able to make her hand write anything true. At the 3rd post he said, without looking at her, "Ma'am, I've got no place in what your father decides. But if the number on the note is the trouble, there are ways to work a herd down through a hard year that don't cost you the breeding stock. I've seen it done." She looked at him. "You've seen it done?" "Yes, ma'am, in the Powder River country. A man I worked for, his son took ill and the bank came harder than it should have. He held on 3 seasons past what anyone thought he could. It cost him, but he kept the ground." "How?" Wyatt set another staple and drove it. He was quiet a moment, arranging his thoughts, and she saw that he was a man who did not speak on a subject he had not first walked through in his own mind. He sold his yearlings early into a soft market and took the loss on them, which was the hard part. He kept his breeding cows and his best bull. He cut his hired crew to 2 men through the summer and worked the fence and the water himself. He took a second mortgage on his hay ground and used it to carry the note, because hay ground is cheaper to borrow against than herd. And he let his neighbors know he was in it, which cost him some pride but got him 2 winters of feed at cost from a man who owed him a favor from before. Clara stood at the post with her hands in her pockets. She had not moved. "That's 4 things," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You've been thinking about our herd." He looked at her for the first time since he had started on the fence. "Yes, ma'am. I've been thinking about it since Das told me the note was coming due in June. It's not my place, but I've been thinking about it." She did not know what to say. She stood a while with the wind cutting across the pasture and the smell of coming snow on it, and she looked at Wyatt Hale in his old coat and his scraped boots and his hat pulled low against the wind, and she thought that this was a man who had done a thing he had not been asked to do and had done it because the work needed doing, whether he was there to see it finished or not. "I would like to hear you say those 4 things again in the kitchen tonight," she said. With my father listening, Wyatt was quiet a moment. Then he took his hat off, held it against his chest, and put it back on. "Yes, ma'am." He came up to the house at 7. Clara had told her father at supper that Wyatt Hale had something to say about the note, and her father had set his coffee down slow, and he had looked at her across the table with an expression she could not read, and he had said only, "Then let him come up after supper and we will hear him." Wyatt came in through the kitchen door with his hat in his hand and his boots scraped clean and his coat off, which he had left on a peg in the mud room, and Clara saw that he had washed his face and the back of his neck at the pump. Her father was in the parlor at the desk, with the calving book open in front of him. He did not stand when Wyatt came in. He gestured to the chair opposite him, and Wyatt took it, and Clara stood at the sideboard where she could see both men's faces. "Das speaks well of you," her father said. "He tells me you catch what he misses." "Das is a good foreman, sir. He doesn't miss much." Her father almost smiled. He turned the calving book so it faced Wyatt. "My daughter tells me you have thought about our note." "Yes, sir. Tell me what you have thought." Wyatt did not hurry. He laid the 4 things out the way he had laid them out at the fence. The yearling sold early, the breeding stock held, the crew cut to 2 through summer, the hay ground mortgaged rather than the herd, and the neighbors told plainly what the shape of the trouble was. He did not sell them. He said each thing the way he had said the wire needed a staple. Her father listened without interrupting, and when Wyatt was done, her father sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the parlor for a long moment before he spoke. "You would sell yearlings into December." "Yes, sir. The market's soft, but it will be softer in February, and February you're paying to feed them. And you would mortgage the hay ground." "Sir, the hay ground is 32 acres of bottom land with water on it. The bank will lend 70 cents on the dollar against it without walking the fence line, because they know what it is. They will lend 40 against the herd if you're lucky, and they will send a man out to count. The hay ground is a cleaner instrument." Her father looked at him a long time. Clara stood very still at the sideboard. She had not known that Wyatt would speak of the hay ground as a cleaner instrument. She had not known he would use the word instrument at all. She saw her father register it too, the small careful shift in his face when a man he had taken for a hand said a banker's word without reaching for it. "Where did you learn to talk about paper, Mr. Hale?" "My father kept a small freight outfit down in the Nation, sir, before he died. 3 wagons and a warehouse. I kept his books from the time I was 14 until I was 22. I know what a note looks like." Her father was quiet. "And why," he said finally, "are you working a calving shed in December on a wage hire out of Cheyenne if you know what a note looks like?" Wyatt did not answer at once. He looked at the calving book on the desk, and he looked at his hands, and he looked back at her father. "Sir, when my father died, the outfit went to his second wife, which was the right of it. I had no claim I wanted to press. I took what my mother had left me, which was not much, and I went north. I have been north 8 years. I am not looking to keep books again. I am looking to work outside until I have put by enough to run a small place of my own, which will be some years yet. I told you what I thought about the note because your daughter asked me to. That is the only reason." Her father looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her father. Neither of them spoke. Her father closed the calving book and set his hand flat on the cover. "Mr. Hale, I will think on what you have said. I would like you to come back tomorrow evening at the same hour." "Yes, sir." Wyatt stood, took his hat from where he had set it on the arm of the chair, and went out through the kitchen. Clara heard the mud room door close behind him. Her father sat a long time with his hand still on the calving book, and he did not look up at her, and she did not press him. Wyatt came back the next evening, and the evening after that. By the end of the week, the 3 of them were meeting at the parlor desk after supper as a matter of course, and Das had been called in twice to sit at the 4th chair and speak to the state of the herd. Her father did not announce that any of this was happening. He simply stopped asking Wyatt whether he could come, and Wyatt simply came, and Clara set out 4 cups instead of 3, and nobody in the kitchen remarked on it. Her father had a way, when he was thinking, of setting his palms flat on the desk on either side of the book and looking at the wall above the mantel, as if the answer were written there in a script only he could read. He did this on the 4th night after Wyatt had gone through the numbers a second time, and he sat that way a long moment before he spoke. "Mr. Hale, if I do what you propose, and the yearlings sell as you say they will, and the hay ground carries the note through the summer, I still owe Ellis Marsh a wedding in April." Clara did not look up from the ledger. Wyatt did not answer at once. "Sir," he said, "that is not a thing I have any place to speak to. I am asking you to speak to it." "No, sir, you are asking me to tell you whether the plan works without the Marsh money. It works without the Marsh money. That is what I can tell you. What you owe Ellis Marsh in April is between you and Ellis Marsh and between you and your daughter, and I have no part in it." Her father looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Clara. "Clara." She set her pencil down. She kept her hands flat on the ledger where she had been checking the yearling column against the shed record. She did not look at Wyatt. She looked at her father and she said, "If the note can be carried without the Marsh money, then the wedding is a thing you chose because you thought there was no other way." There was another way. Her father was quiet. "There was another way," she said again, "and I would like you to write to Ellis Marsh and tell him so. That will not be a small letter to write, Clara. No, sir, it will not be. He will call the freight contract. He will call it whether I marry his son or not, father. He will call it the first time his son's freight route runs light, and he will look at us across a table, then the way he looked at us across the table in November, and there will be no daughter left to sign away." Her father looked down at his hands. He was a proud man, and he was a man who had lost a wife young and had raised 2 daughters against country that took more than it gave, and he was not a man who admitted an error easily. Clara had known him all her life, and she had never heard him admit one to her directly. She did not expect him to now. He said, "I will write the letter tomorrow." That was all he said. He did not apologize. He did not look at her. He closed the calving book and stood, and he laid his hand on her shoulder for a moment as he passed her chair, which was the closest thing to an apology he was going to give her, and he went up the stairs to bed. Wyatt sat where he was for a moment, and then he stood, and he took his hat from the arm of the chair, and he said, "Miss Ashwood, I ought to go." "Yes." He went to the kitchen door. He stopped there with his hand on the frame and turned back. "Ma'am, what your father just did was a hard thing. I know it. I only meant that I saw him do it." She looked up at him then. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and his coat over his arm, and his face was the same steady face it had been at the fence and at the wood pile and at the calving book, and there was no claim in it and no pride and no invitation, only the plain fact of what he had said. He had seen her father do a hard thing. He had wanted her to know that he had seen it. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." He nodded once, put his hat on, and went out into the yard. Her father wrote the letter the next morning. He wrote it at the parlor desk with the door open, which was not his habit, and Clara passed the door twice while she was carrying laundry down from the upstairs rooms, and both times she saw him bent over the paper with his hand moving slow. He sealed it before dinner and sent Das to town with it in the afternoon post. Ellis Marsh's answer came back 4 days later, carried by a hired rider who would not come up to the house but waited at the yard gate for a receipt. Her father read the letter at the gate and folded it and put it in his coat pocket and gave the rider a coin and sent him back. He did not speak of it at supper. He did not speak of it that evening at the desk. He only said, when Wyatt had gone and Clara was closing the ledger for the night, "Ellis Marsh has withdrawn the freight contract, effective at the end of the month. He has also written to the county bank that he will not be renewing his letter of guarantee on our note." Clara set the ledger flat on the desk. "What does that mean for the note?" "It means the county bank will call it in June at whatever rate they choose. It means we do the 4 things Mr. Hale set out, and we do them properly, and we hope the yearlings sell as he says. And Preston will not be coming back in January." Her father said this last without expression, and he did not look at her when he said it, and Clara did not press him on it. She understood that he had lost something he was not going to speak about aloud, not the daughter, whom he had never quite been going to lose in the way he had feared, but the sense of himself as a man who could set a thing straight by signing his name to it. He had signed his name in November and it had gone sideways in his hand, and he would be a while making his peace with that. She stood at the desk a moment longer. Then she said, "Father, I would like to speak plainly with you about Mr. Hale." He looked up at her. She had not planned the sentence. It had come up out of her the way corrections came up out of her when she was checking a column of figures, unbidden but true. "What about him? I would like your permission for him to keep coming to the parlor of an evening, not for the note, after the note is settled." Her father was quiet a long time. He looked at her across the desk and she held his eyes and she did not soften the ask and she did not embellish it. "Are you telling me that you have an understanding with him?" "No, sir. I am telling you that I would like the freedom to see whether there is one to be had." "Has he spoken to you?" "He has not, sir. He has been careful not to." Her father let out a breath that was almost a laugh but was not quite one. He rubbed the flat of his hand across his mouth and looked at the wall above the mantel where he did his thinking. "Clara, he is a hired man out of Cheyenne." "Yes, sir. He is also a man who kept his father's freight books from 14 to 22, and who read our note the way a banker reads a note, and who told you the truth about it when it would have been easier for him to say what you wanted to hear. If he had been the son of a rancher 2 counties over, you would have set a place for him at supper the second week he was here." Her father did not answer that. He looked at her a long moment. "You have thought about this?" "Yes, sir. You have thought about it more than a young woman ought to have to." "I have had reason to, sir." He was quiet again. He looked down at his hands on the desk, and he was silent so long that Clara thought he was going to refuse her, and she was preparing herself to accept the refusal with grace, when he said, without looking up, "You may tell Mr. Hale that he is welcome to the parlor of an evening after the note is settled if he wishes to come and if you wish him to." "Thank you, father." "Do not thank me yet, Clara. I do not know that I am giving you a kindness. I only know I am giving you a choice, which is what I ought to have given you in November." She did not tell Wyatt at once. She wanted to. She stood at the kitchen window the next morning and watched him at the wood pile and felt the sentence sit in her mouth ready. But she had learned something from her father's November signing, and what she had learned was that a thing spoken too soon shaped itself around the speaker's need and not the listener's. She wanted Wyatt Hale to hear the sentence when there was room for him to answer it plainly. She did not want him to hear it in a kitchen doorway with an axe in his hand, and a day's work still ahead of him. She waited a week. In that week the yearlings were cut and driven to the sale barn in town, and Doss and Wyatt slept 2 nights in the barn there to see them through the auction, and they came back with a bank draft that was less than her father had hoped for but more than the county bank had expected. The hay ground was surveyed and appraised the following Tuesday. The paper on the second mortgage was drawn up the Thursday after. By the end of the second week in January, the note was not settled, but the shape of settling it was in place, and her father slept a full night for the first time since November, which Clara knew because she had heard him at the desk on the nights he had not slept. She spoke to Wyatt at the fence line on a Saturday afternoon. She had ridden out with him because a section of the west fence had come down in a wind the night before, and Doss had asked her to go along because she knew where the old survey markers were set and Wyatt did not. They finished the last post an hour before dusk, and Wyatt was coiling the extra wire back onto his shoulder when she said, without preamble, "Mr. Hale, my father has said that you are welcome at the parlor of an evening after the note is settled, if you wish to come." He was still for a moment with the wire half coiled in his hands. Then he set the coil down on the top rail and turned to her fully, which he had not done at the fence before. He took his hat off and held it against his chest. "Miss Ashwood, I told him I wished the freedom to see whether there was an understanding to be had. I have not spoken for you. I have only spoken for myself. I understand you. I did not want you to hear it from him first or from Doss or in a way that would put a claim on you that I have not put on you." He was quiet a moment. She could not read his face. She had learned, in the weeks she had watched him at the wood pile and the calving book and the parlor desk, that Wyatt Hale's face did not perform, and she had come to trust that. But she had not known, until now, how much she would have liked him to perform in this one moment, to smile, to look pleased, to make it easier for her. He did not. He looked at her the way he looked at a length of wire he was deciding how to work. "Ma'am, I would like to speak plainly to you, if I may. Please. I have known since the second week I was on this place that you were a woman I would think about after I left it. I have known since the night at the parlor desk when your father asked me whether the plan worked without the Marsh money that I did not want to leave it. I did not speak because you were promised to another man, and because I had nothing to offer you that a man in that parlor would count as an offer, and because I am not a man who will crowd a woman into a decision to save himself the trouble of waiting." He paused. He did not look away from her. "If your father has said what you say he has said, then I will come to the parlor of an evening when he will have me. I will not press you. I will not court you against your speed. I will only sit at that desk and be seen sitting at it, and let you decide, over such time as you need, whether the sitting means anything to you." Clara stood at the post with her hands in her pockets. She felt the cold on her face, and she felt something in her chest that had been braced against the wind since November let down at last. "That will suit me, Mr. Hale." "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on. He picked up the coil of wire. They rode back to the yard side by side in the last of the light, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to. He came to the parlor of an evening, first once a week and then twice, and by the end of February 3 times, and Clara set out 4 cups at the desk as a matter of course. They did not speak of an understanding. They spoke of the herd, and of the hay ground, and of the survey markers, and of a book Wyatt had borrowed from her father on the breeding of shorthorns, which he returned with the pages marked in pencil at the corners. Her father grew easier with him by degrees, the way a man grows easy with whether he has learned to read. Das came up to the house one Sunday and stayed for supper without being asked, which was a thing he had not done in 15 years, and Clara understood, when he took his hat off at the kitchen door, that the crew had made up its mind about Wyatt Hale, and that the making up had happened before hers. The note was settled in June. The yearlings had sold, the hay ground was carrying the mortgage clean, and a neighbor 2 ridges east had sent word that he would sell his summer hay at cost against a favor Clara's father had done his family a decade back. The county bank was paid down to a figure her father could look at without setting his hand flat on the desk. On the evening the last draft cleared, her father called Wyatt up to the parlor and offered him a foreman's wage in the small cabin at the head of the west pasture, and Wyatt accepted both. Josie was the one who said it out loud, later that summer, standing at the kitchen sink with her sleeves rolled and a plate in her hands. "You are going to marry him, Clara. I know it. Have you told him? He knows it too. We have not needed to say the sentence." They said the sentence in September at the fence line where Wyatt had first told her about the 4 things a man could do to hold a ranch through a hard year. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, and she answered him the same way. They were married in November under the cottonwoods at the bend of the creek, a year to the week after the papers had been signed in the parlor. Her father gave her away. He wept once, quietly, at the words, "And thereto I plight thee my troth," and then he did not weep again, and he took Wyatt's hand at the end of the ceremony with both of his own. They lived in the cabin at the head of the west pasture for the first 2 years, and then in the house itself when her father's hip grew too poor for the stairs, and he moved his bed down to the parlor by his own request. Wyatt ran the ground and Clara ran the book, and Das kept the crew, and the ranch through the second hard year lost less than it had lost through the first, and through the third year it made money for the first time in a decade. Her father lived to see 2 grandchildren, a boy who took after Wyatt in the quiet of his hands, and a girl who took after Clara in the sharpness of her figures, and he was buried under the cottonwoods at the bend of the creek in the 14th spring after the wedding, and the whole crew came in from the pastures for the burying, and stood with their hats in their hands. Preston Marsh married a woman from Denver the year after Clara married Wyatt. Ellis Marsh's freight office failed in the panic of the following decade, and the Ashwood Ranch bought the warehouse at the county sale, and Clara signed her name to the deed with the same hand she had signed the second mortgage on the Hay ground. She did not remark on it, and Wyatt did not remark on it, but Josie, who was visiting that week with her husband and her children, saw the signature dry on the paper and touched her sister's wrist and said nothing. Years later, when the youngest of her children asked her how she had come to marry his father, Clara set down the ledger she had been keeping and looked out the kitchen window to the wood pile where Wyatt still split rounds most mornings of a winter, though he was foreman in name and partner in fact, and had hands under him now to do it. "Your grandfather signed a paper," she said, before he understood what he was signing. "And then a man came up from the calving shed with a wrong number in a book and he expected me to fix it. That was the beginning of it." The child considered this a moment. "That is not a very long story, Mama." "No," she said, "the best of them aren't." She closed the ledger and went out to the yard, and the wind off the north pasture smelled of coming snow, and Wyatt looked up from the wood pile when he heard her step, and he set the axe down on the block, and he waited for her to come to him.